For today's video, we're going to be talking about slavery and how it is expanding in the South, but also into the West. Last week, we looked at the North and the market revolution, and I think so often it's easy to separate the two like that, to look at the North and say that they were impacted by the market revolution, by the transportation revolution, and changes in factories. But the South is also going to be impacted because of the market revolution. So the last time we looked at slavery, we talked about the 1790s and we talked about inventions like the cotton gin that ensured the growth of Southern agriculture. The Cotton Kingdom is going to start spreading west, and we're going to see throughout this video that planters are going to shape their social hierarchies and their culture around the institution of slavery, which means that the South is going to become very different from the North, and it does have to do with slavery. However, slavery is going to really hinder the South as well. First, you're going to see that there's limited development of cities or technology. There is also less as far as educational institutions. And the South is going to become increasingly dependent on the North for industrial goods, commercial resources, and even higher education. However, as we move through this lecture, we're also going to talk a lot about the slaves themselves, the culture they create, and the way that they resist the institution of slavery. This week, your primary source discussion board is based on two slave narratives, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs. And I hope that you will take time to really think about how their narratives sort of display the community and the culture that was created by African Americans as well under the institution of slavery. So as I mentioned, one of the first things we're going to talk about is the fact that urban life in the South is stunted because of slavery. The richest men in the South are investing in slaves, land, household goods, creating these massive plantations, and they are not investing in things like industry and technology like what you saw with the North last week. The South also falls behind as far as urban development in most places except for seaports. So places like Baltimore, Charleston, and Savannah. However, even there, commerce is often directed by northern agents, especially cotton brokers. In addition, nearly one-third of Southern whites had no access to cash and instead bartered goods and services, further restricting the urban economy. In the South, only places like Baltimore and New Orleans reached a population of 100,000 by 1850. So very different from what we saw with those large cities in the North, places like New York and Boston when we looked at those last week. Despite the scarcity of Southern cities, the cities that they do have attracted many free blacks. It provided them with the best hope of finding employment and distancing themselves from planters. The growing demand for cheap domestic labor in urban areas and planters' willingness to emancipate less valuable single female slaves meant that free black women usually outnumbered men in these cities. A lot of times you'll see that women are going to be working as washerwomen, cooks, or general domestic servants, while free black men labor as skilled artisans, dock workers, or sailors in these seaports. One area that you can really see this is in Baltimore. A lot of studies have been done to show that even when planters had slaves, they could sort of make calculated decisions on how to use those slaves. And sometimes, again, in places like Baltimore where there are not cotton plantations, they can make this decision to send a slave to work, and the profits from that work, the pay, is actually going to go to the slave owner. So you can see that a lot in the seaport towns as well. So not only are there fewer cities in the South, but there are also less transportation innovations that are going to be seen in the South. So the state government and private citizens invest very little in roads, canals, or railroads. Most small farmers trade goods locally, and planters use the South's extensive river system to ship goods to commercial hubs. Where rivers didn't meet this need, sometimes you would see rail lines being built. However, only Virginia and Maryland, with their proximity to the nation's capital, developed extensive rail networks at this time. As we saw last week, technology is making labor easier for people in the North. In the South, however, you see very limited use of new technology, and a lot of this results from masters' attitudes towards African American slaves. They believe that these slaves would be likely to break these or that they are lazy and that they could do more work. And because of that, they really don't invest into these types of technologies. Between 1830 and 1850, the absolute number of both slaves and owners grow. However, slave owners become a smaller proportion of all white Southerners because the white population grew faster than the number of slave owners. At the same time, distinctions among wealthy planters, small slaveholders, and whites who own no slaves also increased. However, it's also important to think about what's happening as far as the population of slaves. So the map that I have up here, I want you to sort of think about how these are going to correlate. So you can see up here, this is a map of the slave population in 1820, and you can see that they are concentrated a lot along the East Coast. You can see there's a very large concentration on the East Coast, and you do have some slavery that's moving into these areas over here. Louisiana has a high number of slaves, but places like Alabama and Mississippi don't have as many slaves. Now, by the time you get to 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, you can see that slavery has really started to expand towards the West, and a lot of that has to do with cotton production. So if you look at the map down here, you'll see that this is sort of what cotton production looks like in 1820. So you can see some of it over here in Georgia, and you can see this a little bit in Alabama. And then if you compare this to the map above, you'll see that it's relatively similar to the map. If you move over here and look at cotton production in 1860, you can see the same sort of trend. The areas where cotton is most prominent, you will also see the population of slaves increasing. What's important to remember about this is that though the number of slaves in the West and in the lower South is increasing, the external slave trade or the international slave trade had already been cut off. This was cut off in 1808. So planters had to figure out a way to get slaves from parts of the upper South into the lower South. And in order to do that, what they're going to start doing is practicing more heavily in the internal slave trade. Now, it existed well before 1820. However, it is going to be ramped up at this time. Basically, what happens is that masters who have slaves in areas like Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, that don't necessarily need as many slaves for cotton production as those in the South, the value of their slaves has increased. There's a demand for those slaves, so the amount that they are worth has increased. That means that they can easily sell those slaves further south and they can make a profit off of them. And it's a terrible thing to talk about this as if it's just sheer economics, but that's the way the planters really see it. They see these people as investments. They see them as money, essentially. Again, no different than the market revolution. We see the idea of capitalism and profit really starting to take hold. The same thing can be said about the South with cotton production and with slaves. So you're going to see the internal slave trade becoming huge. As far as what masters do, a lot of times what they do is they will sell slaves that they deem to be insubordinate or slaves that they don't feel they have a need for. There are also a lot of instances where slaves would be sold to pay for different things that they needed. There are a lot of instances where planters would sell their slaves in order to send their children to school in the North or to send their children overseas. And it's very sad to think about the fact that another human being was able to be sold in order to pay for these types of luxuries. To give you some numbers, between 1830 and 1850, more than 440,000 slaves were forced to move from the upper South to the lower South. On the southern frontier, they endured especially harsh conditions as they carved out new cotton fields and rice paddies or planted and harvested sugarcane. Most of these frontier slaves had been torn away from their families and their communities. So keep in mind that these slaves, again, are being taken away from their families, and it's not like they're going to be able to send letters or to pick up a phone and call them or FaceTime them. They will likely never see their family members again. It's also important to keep in mind that while they were enslaved, the slaves were able to carve out their own culture. One thing that's important to really think about is how they're forming family and kinship networks. So, as you've seen when we talked about the internal or domestic slave trade, a lot of slaves are going to be separated from their families. Children are taken from their mothers, brothers from their sisters, and they're not going to have their immediate family. However, they do still find a way to create their own kinship networks. And essentially, this is where you see slaves sort of adopting each other into their own families and taking care of each other in different ways. In addition to that, even if masters gave slaves English names, they might use African names in the slave quarters to sustain family and community networks and memories. Some also retained elements of West African languages. Along the South Carolina and Georgia coast, for example, enslaved workers spoke Gullah, a dialect that combined African words and speech patterns with English. Agricultural techniques, medical practices, forms of dress, folk tales, songs, and musical instruments all demonstrated continued importance of West African and Caribbean culture to African Americans. This syncretic culture, which combined elements from Africa and the Caribbean with those from the United States, was disseminated as slaves hauled cotton to market, forged families across plantation boundaries, or were sold further south. It was also handed down across generations through storytelling, music, rituals, and religious services. As far as religious practices, they offer an important example of syncretic cultural forms. Africans from Muslim communities, for example, often continue to pray to Allah even if they were also required to attend Protestant churches. Black preachers who embraced Christianity also developed rituals that combined African and American elements. In the early 19th century, slaves eagerly embraced evangelical teachings offered by Baptist and Methodist preachers, which echoed some of the expressive spiritual forms in West Africa. Maintaining their own culture and religion is just one way that slaves were able to resist. In addition to these forms of resistance, slaves are able to resist in other ways as well. The forms of everyday resistance that slaves employed varied in part on their location and their resources. Skilled artisans, which were normally men, could do more substantial damage because they used more expensive tools, thinking about people who might be blacksmiths. But they were less able to protect themselves from things like pleas of ignorance. Field laborers could damage only hoes and a few cotton plants, but they could do so on a regular basis without exciting suspicion. House slaves could burn dinners, scorch skirts, break china and glassware, and even poison owners or burn down their homes. Often considered the most loyal slaves, they were among the most feared because of their intimate connection with white families. Single male slaves were the most likely to run away, planning their escape carefully as far as possible before the owners noticed that they were missing. Women who fled plantations were more likely to hide out for short periods in the local area and return at night to get food and visit family. Eventually, isolation, hunger, or concern for children led many of these women to return if the slave patrols did not find them first. However, there are, of course, many instances of slaves who are able to get to the north in order to obtain their freedom. You'll read about that in one of your primary sources for this week. However, another form of resistance is going to be violent resistance. We have already in this class talked about the Stono Rebellion, we've talked about Gabriel's Rebellion, and today we're going to be looking at Nat Turner's Rebellion. So rebellions in the West Indies, especially the Haitian Revolution, echoed through the United States into the early 19th century. In 1831, a seemingly obedient slave named Nat Turner organized a revolt in rural Virginia that stunned whites across the South. He was a self-styled preacher and religious visionary who believed that God had given him a mission. On August 21st, he and his followers killed their owners, the Travis family, and then headed to nearby plantations in Southampton County. This was a very bloody insurrection that led to the death of 57 white men, women, and children and liberated more than 50 slaves. However, on August 22nd, outraged white militiamen burst out onto the scene and eventually captured the black rebels. Turner managed to hide out for 2 months, but he was eventually caught as well. Tried and convicted on November 5th, he was hung 6 days later. Virginia executed 55 other African Americans suspecting of assisting Turner. White mobs also beat, tortured, or killed some 200 more blacks with no connection to the rebellion. Nat Turner's rebellion is important because it not only shows an instance of very violent resistance to slavery, but for what happened in its aftermath. After the Nat Turner Rebellion, as with most of the rebellions we've looked at, whites became increasingly fearful of their slaves. In places like Virginia and Alabama, places like Louisiana and South Carolina, where there were many areas where the black population outnumbered the white population at least 2 to 1, they were very fearful of what their slaves were capable of doing. Nat Turner's rebellion instilled panic among white Southerners who now worried they might be killed in their sleep by a seemingly submissive slave. News of the uprising traveled through slave communities as well, inspiring both pride and anxiety. The execution of Turner and his followers reminded African Americans how far whites would go to protect the institution of slavery, but it also gave them hope in the fact that resistance could potentially work and maybe someday they would be free. In the aftermath of Nat Turner, a lot more restrictions were put on slaves. More laws were put on the books, punishing not only slaves, but also whites who chose to help slaves. For example, there were new punishments for teaching a slave how to read or for giving slaves certain types of weapons. In addition to that, travel was severely limited in between plantations. Slaves were no longer able to travel quite as freely as if they were able to travel freely before, but at this point you're going to see a lot more restriction. Fears of rebellion again led to stricter regulations of black life, and actual uprisings temporarily reinforced white solidarity. However, yeoman farmers, poor whites, and middle-class professionals all voiced some doubts about the ways in which human bondage affected Southern society. To unite these different types of groups, planters wielded their economic and political authority, highlighted bonds of kinship and religious fellowship, and promoted an idea of white supremacy as well as paternalism. Essentially, they told all other white men, even if they weren't as wealthy, that they were still higher on the social ladder than slaves. In addition to that, you see many yeomen and farmers who do not own many slaves themselves being able to rent slaves for a season from a plantation owner who has more slaves than they need. A lot of times they would even make the price more accessible in order to keep this idea of paternalism alive in those who were not as wealthy. By using slaves, and even if they don't own them, they begin to feel that they are part of this system, and they really start to embrace these ideas of slavery and paternalism as well. From the 1820s to the 1840s, more laws were passed regulating slaves. One reason for this is the fact that many planters were also very active in politics or very active in paying politicians. Most Southern legislatures prohibited owners from manumitting their slaves and made it illegal for whites to teach slaves to read and write. They also limited the size and number of independent black churches, abolished slaves' already limited access to courts, outlawed slave marriage, banned anti-slavery literature, and defined rape as a crime only against white women. They also outlawed assemblies of more than 3 blacks without a white person present. In this ways, you can see the power of the planters really solidifying the power of what they are going to start to see as white supremacy in the South. So just to recap what we've talked about for today, I really want you to understand that there is a culture that emerges in the South that is based on slavery. It is very different from what emerges in the North. However, as I mentioned in the beginning, don't see this as something that is not part of the market revolution. It absolutely is. More cotton is being sent to the North and overseas than ever before. It's causing the price of cotton to continue to increase, and it is also causing the number of slaves in the Deep South to increase as well. As we talked about, the slaves are going to have to come from this internal or domestic slave trade where they are taken from places in the upper South and they are taken further south to places like Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Because of this, slaves are going to be separated from their families, and they are going to have to find ways to form their own kinship networks. We've talked about resistance today as well, and I really hope that's something that you take away from this, is that slaves did try to resist their enslavement. There are daily acts of resistance, things like breaking tools, pretending to be sick, burning homes in some extreme cases. If you're a house slave, things like burning meals. But you also see resistance in the form of culture. You can see that they are maintaining a lot of their African beliefs. And again, in places like South Carolina, you can see Gullah language is something that they are going to maintain. You can also see African elements in their spirituality as well. However, there are more violent forms of resistance like Nat Turner's rebellion. And it's important to keep in mind that these are all valid forms of resistance and show how slaves were trying to get out of the system and trying to better their own lives on a day-to-day basis. We also talked about cotton and how the expansion of slavery is going to start to unify whites around a central culture and a central idea of life that is based on slavery. Planters are very smart when crafting these ideas of white supremacy and creating a social order that is based on race as opposed to class. As long as the poorest of the poor farmers is still a white farmer, in his eyes, he can see that he is better than a slave. So he is not the lowest on this social ladder. And you'll see that this becomes very prevalent in the South. So in all, I hope you really take away, again, the idea of religion, the fact that the North is not the only area that is dependent on the market revolution, but the South is as well, and also the fact that the South and their social order will be shaped around slavery and the subjugation of another people. I look forward to reading your responses to the primary source question, and keep in mind the idea of resistance as you read through Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass, the little excerpts you have from their narratives. If you would like to learn more about either of those narratives, they are published online. You can find those for free, and from there you can read more about them if you are interested in their stories. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. And I hope, with that being said, that you have a good rest of your week and stay safe.